Mr. Speaker, I think we've all just heard a brilliant, incisive, clear, and erudite speech. And on behalf of all my colleagues in MFA, I want to thank Dr. Syed Harun for his contribution. Actually, I agree completely with you, and the thought did go through my mind that maybe I could just sit down and say it. But it is such a good speech, it deserves a response. The analogy you started off with was that Singapore is a yacht in a sea. Actually, think of a sampan in a typhoon. The world has certainly become far more dangerous now and far more inimical to small states. There are tragic wars going on in Ukraine and in the Middle East with horrendous civilian casualties. And there is an elevated risk of a wider conflagration. We're also witnessing deepening fractures in the global economy, ostensibly in the name of resilience and national security, but really due to a more fundamental lack of strategic trust between the superpowers. We also see the continued erosion of global norms and global governance as the world makes this transition from a unipolar moment to a multipolar world. And this has resulted in clearly, visibly inadequate responses to dealing with global challenges like climate change, pandemics, and the challenges and risk of the digital revolution, the biotechnology revolution, and the need for an energy transformation. Domestically, all over the world, we've seen the rise of xenophobia, hyper-nationalism, extremism, and a bitter polarization of domestic politics. And this, as you've said, is accelerated by misinformation and the social media echo chambers. And this is in all countries. Mr. Lee Kuan Yew reminded us, quote, "Singapore has to take the world as it is. It is too small to change it. But we can try to maximize the space we have to maneuver among the big trees," unquote. Our national interests and our vulnerabilities have remained unchanged all these decades. We are still a tiny, low-lying city-state in the middle of Southeast Asia. We are sea-locked. The territorial seas of our neighbors enclose us completely. Our absence or our lack of a hinterland also remains an existential fact. And that means Singapore needs to remain open as an existential need. We can't insulate our people. We can't build walls. History is not kind to small states. Or to put it more starkly, actually nobody would care if Singapore disappeared under the waves overnight. There are many other countries and ports that are queuing up to replace the functions that we currently perform. To survive, Singapore has to be exceptional. We have to be more smart, more nimble, more organized, more reliable, more honest than anybody else. Consequently, Singapore's foreign policy has several fundamental objectives to fulfill. First, to protect our independence, our sovereignty, and our territorial integrity. Second, to secure access to essential supplies, water, energy, food, in fact, almost everything we consume. And to keep the air and sea lanes of communication open. Third, to expand economic opportunities for Singaporeans and to maintain our relevance to the world. And as a small state, I agree with you, we need to advocate for a rules-based order with full respect for international law, because without that, the risk for small states are exponentially high. We try our best to shape global norms by making common cause with as many partners as possible on the basis of sovereign equality, mutual respect, and mutual benefit. Dr. Syed Harun has advised us to double down on our values and principles. Completely agree with you. And that we need to speak up whenever and wherever there are transgressions of international law. And this is precisely what we do. We do not take sides, we uphold principles. And we do so consistently, even if that means, from time to time, having to say no to a superpower or to say no to a long-standing friend. Our consistent application of these principles has allowed us to maintain credibility with major and middle powers and our neighbors. Or put it another way, I say exactly the same thing in Beijing, where I just came back from, as I say in Washington, as I say in New Delhi, or in KL or Jakarta. Actually, everybody knows our positions. They know that it is based on a realistic assessment of Singapore's long-term strategic interests and our long-held principles and values. They know that we're not acting on behalf of their rivals. And they also know that Singapore cannot be bullied or bought. Actually, that makes my job easier because I can say the same thing everywhere. And it does not have to be exactly identical to the positions taken by superpowers. But the most important point you have made is that foreign policy begins at home. And I completely agree with you. Domestic unity, cohesion, and consensus are essential because without that, we cannot conduct effective foreign policy. And I agree with you, we do need to do far wider engagement of Singaporeans. We cannot treat foreign policy as something esoteric and elite. It is an exercise which every single citizen first has a right to gain access to an understanding and to participate in the discussion in the public space. But we also have to arrive at a common position because Singapore, being diverse and vulnerable, will always be exposed to foreign influence. And way before hostility begins, influence operations to divide us, to create uncertainty, to erode our resolve will be conducted against us. So the challenge which we have is we need to engage, we need to explain, we need to persuade, we need to mobilize, and every Singaporean has to know why we take certain positions in the world. And we need every Singaporean, wherever you live, work, study, or travel, to also be our representative. So in a sense, we are all ambassadors now. But I've already said that we are at risk of external forces dividing us. And I mean, just look at some of the recent examples in the last couple of years, right? For instance, we had to take a categorical position on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It was a clear violation of the UN Charter. And if the world accepts that a large neighbor, citing historical errors and crazy decisions, can intervene militarily in the affairs of a smaller neighbor, that is a world which is very dangerous for Singapore. More recently, the appalling human tragedy of the Israel-Hamas conflict. It has elicited shock, horror, anger in all of us. We had to take a categorical stand against acts of terror, which were committed on the 7th of October. Because if someone launched 1,000 missiles in Bukit Panjang, an insurgent force in Woodlands, and took 240 Singaporeans hostage, you know we would have to respond. But even as we asserted the right of self-defense, we also told the Israelis, and some of the MPs were with me when we went to both the Arab countries and to Israel, and we said that your military response has gone too far. And we need an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, and we need the safe and immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. And those of you who accompanied me will know that I said the same thing in Jerusalem, in Ramallah, in Doha, in Cairo, in Abu Dhabi. We do need to recognize that there may be different interpretations of the origins of these conflicts, or even the desired end state. But the point for Singapore is don't let that divide and erode our social harmony and cohesion. And looking ahead, this House needs to be psychologically prepared that there was going to be more foreign policy issues in future which are sensitive, which are prickly, and controversial. And to recognize that Singaporeans will have different opinions. But we need to find consensus, we need to find a middle ground, and as you've said, we need to be able to express that credibly on the global stage. So I want to thank you again. Your key points, foreign policy begins at home, that we need to be consistent overseas, and that Singapore, with all our uniqueness, our diversity, and our smallness, we can play an outsized role to make this world a little bit safer as we navigate the perilous storms in the next few years ahead. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.